Hi, everybody. Getting started just in a couple minutes.
Yep, gonna get started in a couple minutes. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. Good evening, everybody. My name is Janet Myhook, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, which is hosted by Northern New York Audubon. I also want to thank Paul Smith's College for letting us use their Zoom workspace, and in particular, Professor Melanie Johnson for providing technical support tonight. I am co-president of Northern New York Audubon. We're a non-profit organization, and our mission is to promote the protection and proper management of birds, wildlife, and the fragile ecosystems throughout New York. Our activities that we carry out are focused on conservation, education, and community engagement. We offer free birding outings throughout the year in various habitat types in Northern New York. We support local bird-related scientific research and educational activities through our Coleman Grant Program. As a chapter of the National Audubon Society, we advocate for local and federal policies that support birds and the ecosystems on which they depend. Our chapter's territory spans northern New York from Lake Champlain all the way over to the St. Lawrence River, and it includes all of Essex, Franklin, and St. Lawrence counties, and the northern areas in Hamilton, Lewis, and Herkimer counties. If you want more information about our activities, you can visit our website at nnya.org, or you can find us on Facebook. And I'd like to say, please consider becoming a member or supporter of Northern New York Audubon. We would like to acknowledge that Northern New York Audubon is situated on traditional Haudenosaunee territory. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can see that there's a little Q&A box. You can feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A. The chat, we won't be monitoring the chat. If you can put something in there if you want, everyone else would be able to see it. If you have a particular question, though, please put that in the Q&A. So now I would like to turn the focus to our speaker for this evening. Ethan Tapper grew up in Vermont and earned a forestry degree at UVM. He has worked as a forester since 2012, including being Vermont's Chittenden County forester for over 8 years. He was one of the first foresters to earn an Audubon endorsement through the National Audubon Forester Training and Endorsement Program, which started a couple of years ago. 2024 has been a really busy year for Ethan. He was named the American Tree Farm Systems National Outstanding Forester of the Year. He began his own consulting business, Bear Island Forestry, and his book, How to Love a Forest, was published. It is our great pleasure to have Ethan Tapper joining us tonight. Take it away, Ethan.
Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. My name is Ethan. And yeah, what a joy and what an honor it is to be here with you talking about forests and specifically talking about this thing, this book, How to Love a Forest, that I had the privilege of being able to write and now being able to bring to you all. And yeah, it's just been such a cool adventure over the last few months to have, I've over the last 90 days, and I would say that this part of my book tour is almost done, but over the last 90 days, I've done, I think, 71 uh, events all over the Northeast. And, when I started doing this process, I thought that it was going to make me really tired. And in reality, it just makes me feel super energized because I just get to share this book that I'm really proud of and advocate for this message that I really believe in. And it's a really, really special thing. I still have that feeling though, um, that, I like do all these book events and I'm in all these libraries and bookstores and like surrounded by books. But I still have this feeling like, nah, no, this isn't something that we do, right? This is something that other people do. Other people write books. And that's not something that I can do. And this whole process, it happened kind of magically. And I want to talk about the book and the content that's in the book mostly, but also I just think it's such an interesting thing, for me to like sort of rehash how I was able to write this book in the first place, because there's a lot of things like this in life and in conservation, which is that I didn't try to do it all at once. And what I figured out was that there was some stuff that I want to talk about. And I figured out that the time when my brain is the most productive and creative, best for writing, is the first hour that I'm awake in the morning. So for me, that's 5 to 6 a.m. And then I just wrote for that hour every day for 6 years. And it's one of these funny things where, like, it didn't feel scary. It didn't feel intimidating. I didn't know how to write a book. I'd never done anything like that before. But it didn't feel intimidating because I was like, I'm not trying to write a book. I'm just trying to write for now. And there's actually a lot of parallels I found between my work in conservation and specifically working on my own land, which I call Bear Island, and this process of writing this book. So, like, with writing this book, if I had tried to go out and write the whole thing at once, I never even would have got started. And with my land, if I had tried to go out and heal this forest all at once, never would have started. What I could do was to offer like one small thing at a time, writing for an hour, spending a day doing whatever I could on my forest to try and make it healthy again. And what it felt like I was doing was really just like taking a small stone and stepping off my back porch and just like throwing it back there. It's this gesture that by itself is completely insignificant and meaningless. And then you just do it again and again and again. And in the case of the book, 6 years later, you're like, oh my God, there's a book here. In the case of my land, it's like 7 years later, I can't believe how much has changed and how much more healthy and full of life that it's become. So, uh, it's one of these things where it's just this like surreal experience. And thank you all for letting me share it with you. So, the things that I really wanted to talk about in this book, there's a bunch of them. This book is a lot of different things. I would say the most basic thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea that, I worked as a consulting forester and then as a service forester, the Chittenden County Forester, now as a consulting forester again, and I had the opportunity to walk in the woods with these thousands of people. And one of the things that I really realized is that a lot of folks believe that the only way that we can love forests is to leave them alone, and to protect them, we protect them from ourselves. And that is an understanding and an idea that is, and I think in many ways, completely reasonable. We recognize that in this moment, forests are facing this incredible volume of threats and stressors, right? They're dealing with things like deforestation, forest fragmentation, deer overpopulation, pollution, non-native invasive plants, animals, pests, and pathogens, extreme climatic shifts, right? Like all these things they're dealing with at once. And every single one of those things is our fault. And so it's reasonable that we would think that the way that we take care of these forests and other ecosystems is just to leave them alone. And yet, one of the things that you realize as you spend a lot of time with these ecosystems, you start to sort of like realize that they're dealing with all of these things. You start to realize how altered and unhealthy they often are. And as a forester, you start to realize that we also have all these tools that can be used to help them. And in my view, working on the many lands that I manage and the many hundreds of parcels of land that I've advised people on, and also working on my own land, Bear Island, which I talk a lot about in the book, I've realized what a profound act of compassion and love it can be, not just to leave a forest alone, but also to do these bittersweet actions, to do things like cutting trees and killing deer, these incredibly tough things to do, especially if you love trees and you love deer, as I do. But that may be entirely necessary to help these forests deal with these problems. And so in the book, I really wanted to talk about that. And, another thing I'll say about the book is that it's a book about ecology, it's about birds, it's about forests, it's about all these other ecosystems. It's also, I say that it's a love story. It's a love letter to my land, Bear Island. It's a love letter to forests and other ecosystems, love letter to biodiversity. And it's also a very hopeful book. And it's a love letter to a world that doesn't exist yet, which is this world that we can create if we're willing to do these challenging, bittersweet actions, to take action to help our ecosystems that sustain all life, every single thing that lives on this planet, ourselves included, and to do these things to help them, right? And it's a book about a lot of other things. It's about freedom, it's about humility, it's about relationship and responsibility, it's about power, it's about beauty, it's about a lot of other things. And so I want to read first from this section from the introduction of the book, where I talk about what inspired me to write the book in the first place. Once it seemed that there were only two paths to follow: a status quo that saw forests and other ecosystems as commodities, and an opposing force that sought to protect ecosystems from ourselves, to leave them alone. As forests everywhere struggle under the weight of the many threats and the stressors of the modern world, as they suffer the legacies of the past and confront a future that promises challenges like never before, I have realized that neither of these two paths is enough. I have realized that the world needs action intertwined with compassion, relationship imbued with responsibility, death infused with life. I have gone my own way, fostering a divergent vision, a reimagining of what it means to love a forest, engaging in the radical act of trading simplicity for complexity, trading a tidy vision for one that is true. My journey toward these realizations has been long and lonely and sinuous. In my little house at the foot of the mountain, my bookshelf is crowded with books about trees and plants and animals, birds and bears and fungi, the relationship between people and ecosystems, and the threats both face. Never have I found a book that has articulated what a forest truly is, not just its botany and its biology, the contours of its many pieces and its parts, but how this entire living community moves and behaves and changes. Never have I found a book that described what it means to care for a forest like Bear Island, an ecosystem that has been changed and degraded and depleted and left to suffer alone. Never have I found a book that described the pain and the joy and the anxiety of trying to love and protect an ecosystem, of guiding it toward wholeness at this strange and crucial moment in time. No book has prepared me for the many complex and bittersweet choices that I would someday make at Bear Island, or for the fact that these actions would be celebrations, the substance of a truly radical and responsible relationship with the forest. In this book, I draw these disparate threads together, exploring what it means to love a forest in this change and changing world. It is a new land ethic, a vision of relationship and responsibility, freedom and power, resilience and humility, legacy, beauty, and change. In a world that is both human and wild, both wounded and vibrant, both suppressed and emergent. This is a vision both for how we manage forests and take care of ecosystems, and how we manage ourselves, how we take care of each other. So I want to especially revisit the last part of that, that this could be that we can have a vision for like how we take care of ecosystems that also involves us, right? In this world that is both human and wild. Um, and that this can be a vision for both how we take care of ecosystems and forests and how we take care of each other. Because I think one thing that has been missing from our discussion, conservation, right, is often ourselves. And this recognition that we don't just have this luxury of being like, we can just like put all these ecosystems of this biosphere over here, and then we can just like live over here. We are in this together, and we impact ecosystems all the time. Everything we do, everything we consume, everything we're wearing, everywhere we live, all of that impacts ecosystems. And it's okay, and it can be okay. And it also needs to be like, as we think about how we're trying to protect these ecosystems, to also recognize that, like, we also live here and we want to live in a world where we have communities that have, these qualities that we want, right? And we want to have things like opportunity. And we want to have things like freedom. And that's all okay. But as we're thinking about this vision for conservation, that needs to be a part of it too. And I'd never really heard that articulated in a book before, which is another reason that I wanted to write it. And so I'm just going to revisit to give you this sweet vocab word and to read a very short reading. So this is it. Forests are socio-ecological systems. Our lives are forever stitched into the green flesh of the biosphere. The separation of the human world from the wild world is an illusion. We cannot care for ecosystems without recognizing that we will always rely on them and we will always tax them. That human life will always be precious and worth nourishing and will always come at a cost. We cannot choose if we will impact ecosystems, if we will impact peoples across the globe, if we will impact the lives of future generations. We can only choose what that impact will be. So, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about me. Um, One of the fun things about this whole process of like doing all these book events and getting to like get interviewed about the book and stuff like that. Folks always want to know like how I became a forester and how I ended up writing this book. And so, like a superhero, um, I get to have an origin story. And if you haven't done this process, by the way, of finding your own origin story or realizing what your own origin story is, it is a really cool exercise because it allows you to like go back and re-examine all of these random and haphazard choices that you made and be like, oh yeah, actually, this led to this, this led to this thing that seemed unimportant actually became really important. And that's what got me to where I am. So this is my origin story. I grew up in southeastern Vermont in a little town, a little village called Saxon's River. And it's like 300 people and it's surrounded by forests. And when you hear these interviews with people who are like nature writers and biologists and ecologists, I feel like a lot of times they're always like, I was just like the nature kid and I was crawling around in the dirt looking at bugs and I was like catching frogs and I was tracking deer. And I always knew that this is something I wanted to do, be working in the woods. And that wasn't my experience at all. And what I really actually remember very strongly about that time is that I wanted to get out of there bad. And I remember when I was a junior in high school telling somebody, I don't know where I'm going to go to college, but I know where I'm not going to go. And that's the University of Vermont because everybody goes there and I'm getting out of here. Well, the first month of my senior year of high school, I got this letter from the University of Vermont that told me that I got this scholarship called the Green and Gold Scholarship, which is a full scholarship. And I was kind of like, guess I'm going to the University of Vermont. No integrity, no principles. I was just like, geez, I guess we'll just do that. And even once I got there, though, I didn't know what I wanted to study. And I was kind of bumping around, taking different classes, didn't know clear path. And as I was finishing up my second semester, my high school girlfriend, who was still with, first big love of my life, was coming back from this wilderness expedition. And when she came back, she had had this experience that was like life changing and massive and, totally changed everything, her whole outlook on life. Impactful, beautiful. Uh, and I had not had an experience like that. I'd just been sitting in my dorm room playing beer pong or whatever. And it was freaking me out. We weren't connecting, and I was afraid that we were going to break up. And so, as a perfectly rational 19-year-old would, I said, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going on a wilderness expedition. And the next one left in 2 weeks. And it was a 6-month expedition where we skied north for 3 months, and then we built a canoe and we canoed back down. Now, in retrospect, I did this for no reason. Relationship didn't work out, but of course, it changed the course of my life. And after that, all I wanted to do was just be in the woods. And I worked as a wilderness guide. I lived in this like uninsulated yurt in the woods of Maine with a fir bough floor for a year. Worked with draft animals, did a little bit of draft horse logging. And then after a couple of years, I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that I had to come back or I was going to lose my scholarship. And so I remember sitting on the bow floor of my yurt and looking at a paper list of all the majors at the University of Vermont. And I scrolled down and I saw forestry, and I didn't know what it was, but I knew that it had the word forest in it, truly. And I was like, geez, I guess we'll just try that. And of course, it ended up being a really good fit. So there's a couple things that are really special about forestry. One thing that I think is unique about it is that in these fields of these like environmental sciences, natural sciences, there's a lot of like specialties, right? Where you can be an entomologist and you can look at bugs, and you could be an ornithologist, you can look at birds, and you could be a botanist, you can look at plants, and a million others. You could be a mycologist and look at fungi. You can be a myrmecologist and you can study ants, right? And only this one thing, foresters are responsible, in my view, for this whole ecosystem. Ecologists would be another one that's similar. Instead of looking at this like one specific part, you're looking at this whole system, the forest. And it's really neat because to study forestry, you have to know a little bit about all that stuff. You have to know a little bit about soil science, geology and hydrology and dendrology and ornithology and wildlife biology, all these different pieces and parts that combine to create these functional, beautiful ecosystems. And you start to see these relationships drawn between these different things that make these ecosystems function and are key to their integrity, right? And it's a really, really cool exercise to do, and I think that broader vision of like how that ecosystem works is really, really important to us understanding how to care for them. And the second thing that is really, really beautiful and important about forestry is that it's a little bit unique also in that at its heart, it's a discipline of action. Imbued in us is this idea that we do not have to be bystanders in these ecosystems, that we can go into them and we can see what's going on, and then we can do something about it. So when I'm being like cheeky with my colleagues who are botanists and ornithologists and entomologists, I'll tell them, geez, if you want someone to come into your forest and tell you what all the different plants are, call a botanist. If you want someone to tell you what all the bugs are, call an entomologist. If you want someone to tell you what all the birds are, call an ornithologist. And if you want to do something about any of that stuff, you call a forester. It's this idea that we can be a part of these ecosystems. And it's interesting too, a lot of the stuff I talk about in the book is that like there's all this nuance, right? Like we know that forestry is not one thing, right? We know that it can be done in ways that are exploitative and that are extractive. And done in a different way, it can be regenerative and generative, and healing and really, really important to the integrity and to the future of these ecosystems. And it's just a really cool thing to get to do, to understand how to use these tools at our disposal to go into these ecosystems and to affect such essential, powerful, positive changes, right? To do things like to help them heal from the wounds of the past, to help them navigate these threats and stressors of the present, and then to help them move into this future. which is incredibly uncertain and promising challenges like never before. So after I graduated from forestry school, I took a job actually in the Adirondacks, working for a larger forestry company, and then uh, became a consulting forester working for a smaller consulting forestry company in central Vermont. After that, I became the Chittenden County Forester. In Vermont, the county foresters are service foresters. So we are resources for landowners and conservation organizations and foresters and loggers, just about how to understand their forests and to manage them better. And I did that for 8 years and then started my own business just this June, which is called Bear Island Forestry. And it was a really interesting experience. All of those experiences were really interesting experiences. But one of the most impactful, probably the most impactful of them, really, was being the Chittenden County Forester, being the service forester. In which capacity I got to visit with thousands of different people, hundreds of different parcels of land, and to see some of these sort of broader themes, just like where our forests are at broadly, and sort of where we are at as their stewards and as people in this world with them, right? So I noticed a couple of different themes that I think are real barriers to us taking care of them. One of them is that folks don't even really understand what forests are. So when I'm doing these events, I ask a group of people, I'll be like, all right, so easiest question ever, what's a forest? And, everybody knows the answer, like we know it, right? And then if I press them on it, they would crumble because what we know about forests is that they're this place with a bunch of trees. And you know it when you see it, and that's pretty much it. However, when you really dig into what these ecosystems are all about, you start to see that those trees are the tip of the iceberg. So the forests are better described by this definition for what we call a natural community, which is taken from this book called Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is a book about the natural communities of Vermont. Um, and this definition of a natural community goes a little bit further than a bunch of trees, or a lot of bit further than a bunch of trees. It says, quote, a natural community is, quote, an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So what that means is that it expands our definition of what forests and other ecosystems are, right? So it includes all of the living stuff, not just the trees, but the trees and the plants, the animals, the fungi, the bacteria, all of those living pieces and parts. And it also includes the physical environment, the things that we would traditionally think of as the non-living components of that ecosystem, the abiotic components, things like soils, waters, geology, where that ecosystem is physically on the landscape. And it is also inclusive of even the way that those ecosystems change. These natural processes, things like the profound and beautiful process of tree mortality, which, by the way, is as normal and as natural and as ancient and arguably as essential to the life of these ecosystems as the lives of these trees. And these natural processes like windstorms and ice storms, forest fires that are as normal and as natural and as ancient and as essential to these ecosystems across our landscape as, all those trees being able to stand there and live forever. So it's really important that when we're thinking about what the forest is, that we're using this more inclusive definition. And the reason that that's important is not only does that change what we call the forest, but it also changes what it means to care for it, right? So if we're like, a forest is a bunch of trees, and how we care for the forest is we keep this bunch of trees alive. It's very different from being like, our job is to be the steward of this ecosystem, which is dynamic and is comprised of thousands of species of living things, right? And to care for all of those things and all of those processes, all of that stuff that the forest really is, might require us to sometimes make some compromises. Like, might require some trees to die in order to care for the health of that entire thing. which is really what we're trying to do. And the best analogy that I can think of for what a forest is like to me is that it's like a coral reef, right? And the trees are like the coral. They're this living structure that defines this ecosystem around which this community is built. But if you or I were to describe a coral reef, we would never be like, it's a place with a bunch of coral. We would never picture it as a bunch of coral. We would think about it in terms of this incredibly diverse community of living things that are woven around that living structure, right? And that's what forests are like to me. So I want to do another reading. And it's from the first chapter of the book, which is about reimagining forests. And in this chapter, I'm pruning the trees in my orchard at Bear Island, and I'm sort of juxtaposing this orderly, tidy, managed system with the wild forest around it. A group of chickadees visits me, flitting from fence to fence. I pause to watch their circus. As my pruning shears quiet, I hear nuthatches and dark-eyed juncos, the pounding of a pileated woodpecker on an aspen. As I've learned to recognize more of the forest birds, a cacophony has become a chorus. Each species of bird calls its own name. Each touches the forest in a different way, each finding habitat within different pieces and parts of this living community. Each is unique. A decade ago, I looked into the forest and saw faceless trees, each like the others. As I learned to tell sugar maple from red maple, the flat needles of hemlock from the angular needles of spruce, the peeling bark of paper birch from the creamy bark of aspen, the forest has become a creature of diversity and complexity and depth. Each tree species is habitat for different birds, insects, and mammals, each growing on different sites and in different ways, each flourishing different flowers and bearing different fruits. Each is precious. Once I saw forests as no different from orchards. I've since learned to reimagine the forest as something messy and imperfect, complex and undefinable, dynamic and expansive over space and time. I have learned to see the trees in the forest as the coral in a coral reef, the living structure at the center of a community of boundless depth and diversity. I have learned that an understanding of what healthy forests look like, how they work, and what it means to take care of them is not something that any of us are born with. It is something that we need to develop. I have learned that forests are not supposed to be pleasant or understandable or beautiful to us. They are what they are, and it is up to us to meet them there. Now, when I look into the forest, I see kaleidoscopes of interactions and connections, critical pieces and parts as diminutive as a bed of moss on a rotting log and as massive as a mountain, a region, a continent, a biosphere. Now I see that the fungi and the bacteria of the soil, the insects, the mosses and the lichens, the beech and the oak, the deer and the owls and the bears, these things do not live in the forest. They are the forest. The windstorms and the ice storms, the forest fires and the floods, the death and the change, these things do not happen to the forest. They are the forest. Once I thought that being a forester meant being a caretaker of trees. Now I see myself as the caretaker of a reimagined forest, the steward of every piece of this incredible volume of life. So I want to go back and touch on something here again that I mentioned in that reading, which is that this idea that an understanding of what healthy forests are, what they look like, and what it means to take care of them is not something that any of us are born with. So this is another thing that I run into again and again and again, which I think is a real barrier toward people taking care of these forests. And I think one of the things that uh, it wasn't something that I was expecting to find, but as I walked in the woods with these thousands of people, I found that our sort of instinctive, intuitive vision of what a healthy forest looks like is remarkably consistent. And this is what it is, and I think that, if you'll allow yourself to think about what this forest looks like, you'll see how nice it is. I call it the cathedral. It's these big, evenly spaced trees and this tall, arching canopy. And the understory is open. You can just see right through it. Now, something that's interesting about this vision is that if you or I walked into a forest that looks like that, and on some level, we would be like, wow, a perfect forest. And the interesting thing about this vision is that it has nothing to do with what healthy forests look like, and it has everything to do with us. And I would actually characterize it as being almost the opposite of what a healthy forest actually looks like. So there's something that's really interesting here, which is that, we are not instinctively equipped with the ability to know what these ecosystems are supposed to look like. There could be a bunch of different reasons for like why we carry this vision around with us. My guy, E.O. Wilson, is a big hero of mine, famous biologist, myrmecologist. He suggests that, there's a bunch of studies that seem to say that we are predisposed toward these savanna-like environments, which is really what that cathedral forest is like. And that could be because we evolved in savannas for tens of millions of years. And that on some level, like every other animal on Earth, we have these instincts, and our instincts are drawing us back toward the habitat to which we are adapted. It could also be because most forests on our landscape look like that, right? Most forests on our landscape in New England are these like 60 to 100-year old forests, 60 to 100 years removed from being, in many cases where I am, an agricultural field, could also be a clear cut, these very young forests. And these young forests are often dominated by trees that are all about the same size, relatively evenly spaced, that have these tight canopies that don't allow light to reach the forest floor. And so you have this open understory. They haven't had enough time to develop qualities like dead wood on the ground, which require those natural processes, tree mortality, things like that to occur. That would make that understory seem, you know, more closed off to you or less open. And and it could be that we're suffering from something that's called shifting baseline syndrome at the same time, which is that shifting baseline syndrome is the conditions that we're used to, we assume are normal. And it's interesting because many of us, who walk in the woods, we walk in the woods and we have a sense for maybe what a normal forest looks like, what it feels like. And we assume that that's what a normal forest is, when actually the forests that we have across our landscape by and large have nothing to do with what a normal forest looks like. They are completely abnormal when they're compared with the way that forests have looked across this landscape for thousands of years, and normal only for the last few decades. So, when we want to understand what a healthy forest actually looks like, a better template is to look at our remnant old growth forests. Now, old growth forests are tricky to characterize and be like, this is what they're like, because they're defined by their irregularity and their variability. But in general, they seem to share a few different qualities in this region, right? So in general, they have some big trees, but not a lot, often just like 10 to 12 big trees per acre. They are equally defined by a quality that in the ecological parlance we call structural diversity or structural complexity, what I increasingly call multi-generationality. All these different sizes and ages, generations of trees created by that forest continually experiencing disturbances and tree mortality, and then regenerating with a new generation of trees again and again and again until it's this multi-layered mosaic of all of these different tree species and sizes and ages. Those forests are also equally defined by the presence of dead wood on the ground, right? This incredibly foundational habitat structure. My mind-blowing fact about dead wood on the ground is that a dead tree can have 4 times the biomass as a living tree, which really makes you actually kind of question what it means for a tree to be alive. Um, but So these old growth forests, if we, sort of apply that instinctive vision that there's forests are supposed to look like these cathedrals, for these forests don't look anything like that. And so it's important that we adjust what our expectations are and that we recognize that, you know, the conditions that we find in these old growth forests are important not just because it's like a blast from the past and, ooh, this cool old thing that there's not that many of. It's important because the conditions that we find in those old growth forests are the conditions that dominated our landscape for thousands of years, and the conditions to which all of our native biodiversity is adapted, right? So when we are missing those conditions, when we're missing that structural diversity, that multi-generationality, when we're missing those big trees, when we're missing that deadwood on the ground, which by the way, across our landscape, we are missing all of those things. Uh, we are missing habitats for thousands of different species of living things to whom that is, where they live, right? Those are the conditions that we need. You can look at this in terms of forest birds, and you can see this very plainly, right? That there are forest birds that need tall, mature forests, that need middle-aged trees, that need younger trees, that need a combination of all of those different things for different parts of their life cycle and different times of the year. There are forest birds that need deadwood on the ground, that need gaps in the canopies, that need big trees with these complex canopies, that need cavities in those trees, that need all of these things combined together, right? And so when we don't have forests that are this diverse, complex thing, we're not providing habitat for all of the living things that live here. And it's really important that we do. I think that one of the things that I try to point out to people a lot of times is that, we often misunderstand things like biodiversity, right? We've all heard that term, biodiversity. It's a contraction of biological diversity. It's all the species that live here, essentially. And we often misunderstand that as being something that's like nice to have. Like, isn't it nice? Isn't it pretty? Right? We can go out there and we can see a beautiful bird. And from an ecological perspective, that's not what it's about at all. That biodiversity is essential to the function of these ecosystems. It's not something that's nice to have. It's something that's essential to their resilience, to their integrity, to their ability to sustain themselves, to their ability to be functional and beautiful, and everything that they need to be in this moment. So, one thing that's really an interesting process that we all have to go on and that we all get to go on is to redefine what we think these ecosystems are supposed to look like, right? And it's a process that will make us uncomfortable because those old growth forests, tell you what, offend our every aesthetic sensibility. And yet it's something that we got to do. And there's a lot of things like that, in this process of loving forest, as I talk about it in How to Love a Forest, where it's like um, things that make us uncomfortable, right? Things that are counterintuitive, things that are seemingly contradictory that we just have to embrace anyway. So, I had all these amazing learning experiences and, really, cut my teeth as a forester in the consulting forestry world and moved into this service forestry world, working with all these different people, managing thousands of acres of land. But my most impactful experience by far was when I became the owner of my own piece of land, which I now call Bear Island. Now, the first thing that I heard about Bear Island was um, my buddy was like, "Oh, did you see that big piece of land for sale?" And it was, on this realtor's website. I hadn't heard about it, went and looked at it. And all that there was, it said 175 acres for sale. And all that there was a picture of this mountain, Camel's Hump, right? As if to say, just put your mansion right here and you can look at Camel's Hump. No mention of the forest at all. I was like, geez, pretty cheap. I wonder what's wrong with it. And so I went to go find out. And my first impression of actually seeing the land was driving up the access road, and it hadn't been properly stabilized. And there was a ravine cutting right down the center. And I was straddling it with the wheels of the truck. Finally got up to the log landing, this clearing where that picture of Camel's Hump had been taken from, and it was covered in trash. bags of household trash, busted pieces of equipment half buried in the ground, hydraulic hoses and cables, tires, hydraulic buckets. I mean, it was gross. And going out from it in every direction, these 3 foot deep ruts just bleed in murky water down the mountain. It was not a very good way to start. And I was like, geez, I'm here anyway. So I'll go take a look. So I started to walk up this main logging trail, skid trail, and it was really steep. And I was getting covered in sweat and I was picking ticks off myself. And I was walking and walking and walking. And as I was walking, something started to bother me. I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't know what it was. And I was walking for about an hour before I realized what was bothering me was that I hadn't seen any healthy trees. There were no healthy trees there. And it was pretty jarring and weird once I realized that. And I started looking around, being like, no healthy trees, no healthy trees anywhere. What I now know happened is that 30 years before, previous landowner had just told these loggers, without the supervision of a forester or anything like that, told these loggers, go cut every tree bigger than 10 inches in diameter on the mountain. So a 10-inch diameter tree is pretty small. It's like that. And they cut them all. And this is an unethical practice. It's really not forest management. It's probably like closer to mining, a purely extractive practice. It's called diameter limit cutting. And really what it is one of these practices that we call broadly high grading. Now, high grading is where you go into the forest and you cut all of the most valuable high grade trees and you leave all the least valuable low grade trees standing there. And the problem with this is that those high grade trees are usually the healthiest trees in the forest. And those low grade trees are the least healthy trees. And so what you're doing is essentially managing that forest to be less healthy. It would be like if you, in the middle of summer, you go out to your vegetable garden and there's your vegetables, your carrots that you planted and your tomatoes and they're surrounded by weeds. And you just go there and you weed out all the vegetables. That's what this forest was like. And as I kept on walking, just being like, oh my God, no healthy trees, no healthy trees. And, saw that even in places where the forest was kind of trying to regenerate, that all those young trees that were regenerating were getting browsed by deer. There's evidence of a deer overpopulation there, as there is, by the way, almost across our entire continent. Uh, I slid down over these cliffs that bisect the land from west to east and right into a 30-acre infestation of a non-native invasive plant called Japanese barberry, just 3 foot tall, pure, no native plants. Which, if you know that plant, you know that that is a forest without a future that has absolutely nowhere to go and will never be healthy again until that's dealt with. And at that time, I had never seen a non-native invasive plant problem that dense or that expansive, and I'd never heard of anyone solving a problem like that. So I was pushing through that barberry patch and got back to my truck and I said, forget this place, in different words, and then left. And, sure enough, over the next couple of months, I started to think about it and think about it. That piece of land was still up on that realtor's website. And I started to wonder if there was something that I could actually do to help this place, if that place was actually hopeless, or if there was something that I could do to help. And so a couple of months later, I went back. And when I went back, I started to find all this cool stuff, all these little beacons of hope. I started to find that there were some healthy trees there after all that were just so hidden behind all these masses of unhealthy trees that I hadn't seen. I started to find that there were all these plants that I love, like sweet fern and low bush blueberry and maple leaf viburnum and pink corydalis and red columbine. I found that there were these rock outcrops covered in reindeer moss with these sweeping views of the Winooski River Valley. And I was standing on one of those rock outcrops when I said to myself, I'm going to try and buy this place. Didn't know how to do that, never done anything like that before. So I asked my old boss, Mike, who sold forest land real estate. I was like, Mike, there's this piece of land and I want to put in an offer. How do I put in an offer? And how much should I offer? And he said, well, geez, let me ask you a couple of questions. Is there any timber on it? And I said, no. And he said, any real estate potential? And I said, no. And he said, is the access good? No. Could it be a sugar bush? No. And we kept on going down the line. No, 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 no. And eventually he was like, well, Ethan, this place sounds terrible. Just offer them like nothing and don't be afraid of hurting their feelings. And that's how I became the owner of this piece of land, Bear Island. And it was, such a great teacher in many ways from start to finish because one of the most impactful feelings was standing on that log landing when that land was finally mine. And it's one thing to believe that all we got to do is just get out of the way and that nature's going to solve all these problems, that it's going to, magically fix these centuries of degradation and these non-native invasive plants, animals, pests, and pathogens, the fact that this forest has lost new or functionally lost numerous species of trees and plants and animals, the fact that there's 30-acre infestation of non-native plants that will not solve itself, that there's this deer overpopulation that isn't getting any better, all of these issues, it's one thing to believe that all that's going to be okay. And it's quite another to stand on that log landing, in a forest with no healthy trees, in a climate crisis, in a biodiversity crisis, in a mass extinction, surrounded by trash, watching thousands of years of soil roll down the mountain through those skidder ruts. And I had to ask myself in that moment, if it would be a greater kindness to this place to leave it alone and hope for the best, or to do absolutely everything in my power to help it be healthy again. And one of my superpowers I've realized recently in this effort is that I am not a purist. And so I could ask myself radically, what tools do we have? What tools do we have to help this ecosystem on the verge of collapse be healthy again? And, you know, it's a really interesting thing because what I learned is that we have a lot of tools. And in fact, we have the tools that we need to solve many of these issues in our ecosystems right now. And the difficult thing is that using them well requires us to, not just to, take a chainsaw and start cutting trees randomly, but to take a chainsaw and to really approach that tool with the seriousness that it deserves, with the love of trees, with the love of forests, right? And to be willing to go into that forest and cut trees, not because we don't care, but because we care so deeply. So over the next 7 years, I found that a lot of my work was less, me out there just like scattering wildflower seeds around and, planting acorns and doing all stuff that feels really good. It was a lot of struggle. It has been, and it continues to be, I should say, a lot of struggle. So it was, I had to teach myself how to run excavator and close out, stabilize all those eroding skid trails and build new, more resilient trails. I had to teach myself how to be a deer hunter so I could try to deal with that deer overpopulation. I had to teach myself basically to be a logger, to try and find every single one of those healthy trees and to release them from competition. And where there's no healthy trees, to cut all the trees so that the forest can regenerate a generation of trees that has a chance to be healthy again. And there's a parody that I really like about one thing in particular, which is that I know that 30 years ago, these loggers came to my forest, Bear Island, and used these tools, a chainsaw, piece of logging equipment that we call a skidder, right? Which is specifically, I should say, cable skidder because it has this cable winch on the back, made by this company called Timberjack in probably the late 1970s, early 1980s. And they took these tools, these two tools, and created problems that I'm going to spend the rest of my life fixing. And now today, two of my most impactful tools in helping this forest heal are my chainsaw and my 1981 Timberjack cable skidder. There are all these tools that used in one way can harm ecosystems, can destroy them, can degrade them, and used in a different way can help them heal. And there's another thing like that. It's us, right? We know that we can destroy these ecosystems. We know that we can harm them, but used in a different way, our power and our technology can actually help them heal. And I'm out of time, basically. I want to do just one more reading, and that's important to me. One thing that's uh, I want to say before I start this reading is that this is a book like many books that are out there right now. I think which is it's clear-eyed about where we're at. It's like this moment is scary and it's tough. Um, and a lot of stuff has happened, and a lot of stuff is happening now. And there's a lot of action that needs to be taken. And this is also a book that's incredibly hopeful because the interesting thing about it is, I talk about these concepts of, freedom and power, humility, relationship, and responsibility. All these things are, things that we have an opportunity to grasp more firmly, right? Like not just things that we have to risk losing. One lesson that I really learned from Bear Island, I started this process of healing this ecosystem with this real like mitigation mentality, which I think is actually common to a lot of us. We're all about mitigating. We're like, okay, our loftiest goal is let's see if we can just make it so that this world that we pass on to future generations just isn't any worse than this world right now. That's our loftiest goal. Let's pass on a world that's not any worse than it is right now. And I'm not really interested in that at all. What I'm really interested in is building a better world. And what I've seen at Bear Island is not just that I've stopped the bleeding, I've turned this ecosystem back from the brink of collapse. I've seen it become so much more. I've seen it become so much more diverse and complex, so much more full of life, so much more full of habitat for all of these forest birds, which are like sentinels of these healthy, diverse forests. And uh, and so this is also a book that is extremely hopeful. And I want to read my last reading about that. And then after this, I'll say, if you have questions, throw them in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to answer them after this. The storm clouds stamp their feet. They are corralled along the shifting path of the big river, thundering between the walls of the broad valley. The clouds move west, driven like cattle toward the mountains. As empty as it often feels, there is something beautiful about a life lived in the aftermath. Here in the junkyard of the Anthropocene, we hold the fate of the world, all of its ecosystems, all of its peoples in our hands. In this moment, we can allow this biosphere, our home, to sink further into dysfunction and disarray, or we can make the radical and bittersweet decisions necessary to choose a different path. Inside of this catalyzing moment, we have the opportunity to reimagine our relationship to ecosystems and our relationship to each other, to redefine what we are and what is precious to us. As empty as they often feel, there is something beautiful about a landscape of forests that are just a fraction of their true potential. The forests of our lives are still only at the beginning of their journeys. They may yet become diverse and complex, rich with legacies, ancient again. With our help, these forests may rediscover a capacity for life beyond imagining, an abundance that this world has not known for generations. I pick up another acorn, another product of thousands of years of adaptation and change, another precious thing chained to the legacies of the past and hurtling toward an uncertain future. Perhaps it is doomed. Perhaps it contains endless possibilities. Humidity cloaks the land, drawing tiny round beads of sweat from my skin. For a moment, the mountain is cast in golden light. It smells sharp and strong. As I touch another acorn, a raindrop strikes the back of my hand, rolling between the small bones of my fingers. Suddenly, droplets are stippling the soil like falling stars, throwing up little clouds of dust. I have nowhere to be, and so I kneel, watching the water run around the stumps and the upturned leaves, drawing spider webs on the earth. Someday I will tell my children that the caves in the talus are a womb, the origin of all the black bears on the mountain, and that the springs in the big bowl are the source of all of its waters. Someday I will walk these trails with my children and teach them to reimagine forests as communities of complexity and depth and expansiveness, communities that are fated to change, to celebrate both the miracle of life and the miracle of death. Someday I will kneel beside these stumps, a young forest blooming around me, and teach my children the imperfect truth of what it means to love a forest. Someday I will teach my children that this world is not ours to hold, but that we hold it anyway. That each of us is a steward for one brief and precious moment in time. In our short lives, we must learn to pair power and freedom with humility, to embody relationship and responsibility, even when it breaks our hearts. Someday I will teach my children that despite everything, we are destined to thrive, that we are destined to live in a world that is beautiful. In the years to come, the traces of this moment will fade. This empty patch cut will have become a diverse young forest, the stumps softening and mixing with those of the oaks cut decades ago. I will walk through this young forest and remember this autumn day when my hands were young. I will remember that each tall, perfect oak was once an acorn between my fingertips, that this forest is a child of responsibility, something that we could only have embodied together. No one but me will ever truly know the pieces of myself that I've left on this mountain, the labor of love that being the steward of this land has been. I will know, and that is enough. We owe too much to the future to be imprisoned by the past. As the storm passes over me, I am grateful to be anything at all, grateful to be alive at a time when there is so much worth saving. I want to live in the world that will arise from this moment, the world built by people who are brave and humble and resilient, who make countless bittersweet compromises, who live their lives with the dream of a better world burning in their chests. I want to live in a world that will be created by people planting acorns in the rain. Sometimes this life feels like autumn, the exhausted end of a boundless summer. Today, I choose to live in a world in which spring is just breaking, a world that is just awakening, just beginning to discover what it truly is. I look toward the broken ridge of the mountain and feel a powerful nostalgia, not for the past, but for the future. High above the storm, the light is swelling, calling everything upward toward a world that is just beginning. Thank you. Um,
Thank you.
uh,
So we have two or three questions that have been put in. I'm gonna just go one by one.
Great.
Okay, so the first one is from Lisa. Not having read the book yet, I'm hoping you will comment on how much of it conveys information for amateurs, like what a healthy forest ecosystem does look like, management techniques to
Mm,
consider, versus the more philosophical sections like those you read.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I tried to read the more philosophical sections just because I like them, and I think it's cool with the tone of the presentation. I think that yeah, but I think that there's a lot of like specific ecological information for our region as well. for amateurs. And I think that really important to me from writing this book is that I wanted to write a book that was for everybody. And so part of that is like, you know, basic information about ecosystems in general, but it's also not like a cookbook, right? So it's not like this is literally exactly what you do in a forest to deal with this exact problem in this exact place. And the reason for that is because really what this is a book that I hope will be applicable to people wherever they are, and that is not just for forest landowners, forest stewards, forest lovers from, New England, New York, but can have some relevance elsewhere. So it's this sort of balance, but there is a lot of like also just basic ecological information about like how forests work and what healthy forests are like, and what comprises them as well. Someday I will make like the How to Love a Forest cookbook, and it'll be way fewer people will buy it and read it, but it'll be very useful for the few of us who it's relevant to.
Okay, the next question is from Larry. Did you get rid of the Japanese barberry, and if so, how?
I did. Yeah, and this is one. It's funny whenever people ask me about this, I'm like, uh, you know, I'm always like, okay, we could talk about this because it does get us derailed a little bit. The short answer is that I did it with herbicide, right? And the long answer is that it was this whole journey, right? And if I was standing there and if it was me, Ethan, from 10 years ago, I'd be like, there's no way, that I would ever do that. And what it really felt like was, you know, having dealt with these non-native invasive plants and talked to other people in the conservation community about, the way that we deal with them, and having tried doing literally every other way of dealing with them, it just wasn't possible. And in working with, again, thousands of people, hundreds of people, by the way, that have attempted to control non-native invasive plants without using herbicide and that have a 0% success rate. Um, this is just something that I'm comfortable doing now. And it's weird and it doesn't make any sense. And yet another part of it that I think is really important is that you all know that this is something that most of our conservation community and really every conservation organization that manages these plants at scale, this is what they do. It's not because they don't care, it's because they care so deeply, but they haven't told you about it because the optics are so bad. And I'm like, if this is something that we're doing, we should celebrate it. But we know we can do it in ways that are totally responsible to our soils, our waters, our biodiversity, and that is so much more of a benefit to these ecosystems than not doing it. So there's so much more. I have a whole chapter in the book which is about this because it's really important to me that I message this nuance, and that if that sounds weird to you, I get it. And hear me out. You should read that chapter in the book. I think it's chapter 8, and that'll be a longer form answer for you.
Okay, next is from Jennifer. Great presentation, Ethan. What do you think is the biggest challenge in helping people to embrace this vision of a land ethic? How do you think that challenge should be faced by foresters and other environmentally conscious folk?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there's two different things, right? So there's like one of the challenges is just getting people to care about ecosystems at all, right? Like that's the biggest one, right? And there's that the status quo is that we do treat them like commodities, right? And we do exploit them and degrade them and treat them like they're our bank account. And so that's a hard thing to unlearn. But I do feel like there's a lot of people out there, like there's an increasing amount of understanding and awareness of how essential these ecosystems are to our lives, to our quality of life, and this sense of responsibility again that we have for them. And the one thing that is a bummer though is when we face these situations where they do need help, as many of them do, and if not most of them do, to deal with these incredible volume of issues that they face. And then we're just like, we let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or we're just too scared to do the wrong thing that we do nothing at all. And I think that that's a huge barrier. And I think this idea that, you know, that the only way that we can protect ecosystems again is to like protect them from ourselves. Uh, I get it, but we also have all of this potential to help them. And when you're out in these ecosystems and you see an ecosystem that is like, you know, really, really struggling with these non-native invasive plants or with deer overpopulation or with the fact that like, basically every forest across our landscape hasn't had a chance to develop any of these qualities of an old growth forest that are qualities that we can help them develop, actively, that we can install in them centuries ahead of schedule. Um, when those are things that we can do, I just believe that we have a responsibility to do that. And one thing that I try to tell people too is that because we do have these opportunities, like I believe that we can degrade forests in two different ways: by degrading them in the way that we always have, and by doing nothing. When we have the opportunity to help them.
Okay. The next one is just from Anonymous. I'm learning that there's much more old growth forest in the Adirondacks in New England than was previously recognized. How would you define old growth forest at this time?
There is definitely a lot more in the Adirondacks. Specifically, obviously, in like within the boundaries of the park. And then there is in the rest of New England, because the rest, like in New England, New York excluded, there's like none. I mean, it's like, I think it's something like 1/10 of 1% of the forest. In Vermont, it's like, yeah, it's 1/10 of 1%. It's 1,000 acres statewide in these little fragments. And so the way that we would define old growth in general, the way that it's defined, usually when you see it written about like in the scientific community and research, it is what we call primary forest. So it's essentially forests that have never been extensively impacted by like non-indigenous peoples. So it'll be like, that haven't been logged, they haven't been cleared, uh, they're unmanaged. And then there's other examples that other people, will utilize, but I think that usually that's when we talk about old growth forest, that's what we're talking about. Um, but that said, the interesting thing about old growth forest is that, I also I believe in managing forests, and I believe in also having areas that aren't managed. And of course, like all primary forests, all remaining old growth forests should not be managed. Like they're just this too precious resource that we should just be like thinking of as this incredibly important thing that we have. And there should also be some areas that we also don't manage, the areas that across our landscape that, we're like, this has a really good opportunity to become an old growth forest. And so this is an area that we don't manage. But I was actually talking to someone at an organization that like does this type of conservation, like this wilderness conservation as well. And the one thing that I think is really important to recognize is that also like the thing that makes old growth forest special, one of the things from an ecological perspective is not just that those forests are old and unmanaged, but it's also like the ecological qualities that they possess. They have, right? They have all of these incredible qualities, which are really important habitats, which are really important, supporting really important natural processes and functions in those forests that we don't have in our forests across our landscape by and large. And so one of the things that I think about is not like that, the only way that we can create those attributes is just to like leave a forest alone and let it do its thing, but also to be like, we have forests that like don't have a lot of dead wood, and we have a lot of natural processes and habitats that are relying on that dead wood. And I can put a dead tree on the ground tomorrow with my chainsaw, and one thing I think a lot about is that, to the organisms to whom that's their habitat, that, haven't had that habitat on their landscape, maybe for centuries. They don't care if I cut that tree down with a chainsaw or if that tree fell over on its own. All they care about is that it's there now. So in addition to these other, having protecting these existing old growth forests, maybe letting some areas come old growth forests on their own schedule, I think that we should view like some of this management that we can do to create these old growth conditions to also be a part of that, pantheon of how we honor these old growth forests and how important they are.
Great, thanks. So the last one is the first part of this question is, how is your acorn planting process going? How big is your acorn planting? This is from David. He is also planting acorns. He planted 10,000 this fall.
Mm,
Would you like to hear more? Would like to hear more about your process.
yeah. Thanks, David. Yeah, it's the those of us who plant acorns are a special club. Um, so where to start on this one? Yeah, so basically I started planting acorns, and I talk about planting acorns because they're so on my land when they did that diameter limit cutting, my land is what we call like oak ground. So it's a forest type that would typically be dominated by northern red oak, American beech, red maple, and a variety of other species as well. So, but those would be like the big three. And when they went there and they cut all the biggest trees, a lot of those trees were red oaks. And then a lot of the beech trees suffering from this disease called beech bark disease. So my big, goal has been that has actually made me obsessed with the northern red oak has been like bringing the oaks back. And so one thing that I had to do is, I had acres and acres and acres that were 100% diseased beech overtopping 100% diseased beech clone monoculture. And so I had these areas where I had to create these bigger openings um, to, just to like remove an area that was 100% unhealthy trees that never had a chance to be healthy. But then also because in order to not get just a monoculture of diseased beech again, beech is a shade tolerant species. And so we need to create these bigger openings or it just ends up being like 100% beech sprouts, which is not something that we want, right? We want to grow healthy trees. And those diseased beech trees have a really hard time doing that. So yeah, so I like the acorn planting that I was doing, I was cutting these patch cuts in 100% unhealthy trees, figuring out the understory, and then on an acorn year in the fall, and then leaving all these few remnant oak trees that were there. And then I was just planting them with a stick, the acorns that were on the ground, because I had heard that it can increase their chance of being able to sprout by like 50%. And so I planted tens of thousands of them in the ground just for that reason. And now what I know is that there's a better way to do it. There's a guy named Pat Bartlett who's a forester from central Vermont, and he actually has a whole system, which I think is the best way, which is that he actually collects the acorns, brings them like either buries them in the ground or brings them into his root cellar, lets them sprout, and then he plants them as sprouted acorns with deer protection, basically, and a piece of rebar and this like, you know, shelter. And I think that's the best way because even when you plant them in the ground, like squirrels will find them and stuff like that. But some of them made it, not a lot, but some of them made it. So that you probably have a much more focused and intelligent way of doing your acorn planting. That was me just trying to be like, I just need oaks, and this is my way of trying to really thumb the scales to make sure I get oak regeneration. I do want to tell, I see that that's the last question, so I do want to tell a quick story about acorns before we leave, which I do talk about in the book, which is that I don't know how much of you all know, like, how remarkable it is that any oak tree gets to exist, right? Like that any acorn ever gets to become an oak tree. And I talk about this a lot, which is it's just remarkable that, we know that these oak trees produce these acorns, but they don't do it every year. right? They do it every 2 to 3 years, and they synchronize them. They have these massed years where they produce a ton of acorns, and then in between, no acorns at all. But on a massed year, a mature oak can produce tens of thousands of acorns. Now, on a red oak tree, it takes 2 years to produce an acorn. And in that time, about half of those acorns are parasitized, mostly by this insect that's called the acorn weevil. Uh, okay, so we're already down 50% of the acorns. When they get on the ground, when they actually drop, everything eats them. Turkeys and bears and deer and squirrels and rodents, everything, and blue jays. And it's common for all the acorns left on the surface of the soil to be consumed, right? So that means that in many cases, the only surviving acorns are those that have been cached by rodents. And uh, it's not even that simple, because there's also this thing that's actually been studied, which is called animal personality. Its technical term is intraspecific behavioral variability, which is to say that not every rodent caches acorns the same way. So there are some rodents that will cache them in ways that the acorn would be more likely to sprout, and some rodents that will destroy that acorn or cache it in ways where it can't sprout, right? So it has to be cached by a rodent, but then specifically a rodent that has the behavioral qualities that will allow that to be a viable acorn in the future. And we used to think that squirrels and other rodents would forget where those caches were, that they had bad memory. And now we actually know that they have excellent spatial memory, and that they don't forget where those caches are very much at all. And that the acorns that actually get to sprout are from caches where that rodent has been killed by a predator. So to recap, in order for any acorn to even sprout when its life is arguably just beginning, it needs to have survived 50% parasitization on the tree, yet avoid getting eaten by all these other animals that don't cache them, get cached by an individual rodent that happens to have behavioral qualities that will allow it to cache it in a better way, and to have that rodent eaten by a predator. And it's a miracle that any of these acorns make it at all. And yet somehow you look up at these oak trees and you're like, every single one of these did it. So just a cool thing about acorns. Anyway, so thank you all for hanging out with me tonight. And yeah, and I really appreciate it. Go if you haven't read it already, go check out How to Love a Forest. Ask for it at your independent bookstore. Follow me on social media at How to Love a Forest. And thanks, Northern New York Audubon, so much for having me.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll say goodbye.
Have a good night, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.